Knives Out was an iconic murder mystery film released in 2019, but it also happened to be an achievement in Resident Evil Village that you get for beating the game with nothing but combat weapons. Similarly, Universe's Best Dad was an achievement that you get for beating the game on Village of Shadows, the game's hardest difficulty. Now, both achievements are fairly easy by themselves. Village of Shadows can be completed on New Game Plus, which gave you access to weapons that were outlawed by the Geneva Convention. And Knives Out is made a whole lot easier by getting access to the Karambit or Sith Lord lightsabers that help to eliminate not just the men, but the women and children too. Doing these two achievements at the same time would certainly flag you onto some kind of FBI watch list, but what if we took this one step further? The default knife was the first combat weapon that we find in the game, and despite being extremely effective at cutting assorted cheeses, it remained immensely ineffective at doing meaningful damage to, well, literally anything. The combination of these achievements with this weapon was a recipe for making mustard gas in your bathroom, but like Eve of Adam and Eve, this channel had been abandoned by God, so instead of an apple, we were sitting down for a full 5-course tasting menu as we attempted to PvP our way through Village of Shadows with only the default knife, one hot vampire MILF at a time.
Oh, be careful what you wish for, Ethan Winters.
On our quest to refine Jesus, our story rejoins Ethan Winters, our faceless protagonist with a fetish for amputations, who returns to star in Resident Evil 4's DLC, against his will. Having settled down with his Russian sleeper agent wife, they both welcomed in a new member of the family. With the birth of their 45-year-old one-year-old Chris, there was a faint glimmer of hope that the family could lead a somewhat normal life after Louisiana. But everybody knows that the evil residents are never truly satisfied, and one fateful evening, baby Chris was abducted from the house in the dead of night by nefarious, unknown forces. With no leads, baby Chris was assumed lost forever, and despair and concern had engulfed the Winters' household. That was until an anonymous tip-off claimed that baby Chris had been sighted in a little-known village in Romania. So Ethan took his particular set of skills and used them to book a taxi and fly online, arriving at the village to begin our search for Benjamin Button. Entering the village, the absolute state of this place suggested that we'd maybe taken a wrong turn and arrived in Leeds instead. But ignoring the clear sexual deviancy on display here, we began our detective work, pulling out our knife and proceeding to interrogate the locals for more information on Chris. Our investigation for now would need to take a back seat as we had more pressing issues. Namely, that we wouldn't be pressing anything with our left fingers anymore as they're given the Frodo Baggins manicure. Now, as we faced up to our first enemy in the game, it's worth noting that Village of Shadows is one of the hardest difficulties in the franchise. Not only did enemies body slam you onto life support in one hit, making healing items practically worthless, but the default knife's damage output was on par with hitting someone in the face with a wheelie bin. Comparable to the magnums, the shotguns, and even the other knives in the game, we were at the lowest end of absolutely fucked when it came to our damage output. To put it into perspective, a single Lycan, literally the most basic bitch enemy in the game, has 700 health. So by quickly punching this into our calculator, we could see that it would take 35 slashes of the knife just to kill a single one.
28 samples.
So to the surprise of nobody, that meant straight up hand-to-hand combat was out of the question for this entire run. Instead of relying on brute strength, this challenge would be a tactical battle of the mind. By overclocking our cerebral cortex, we would need to abuse game mechanics, showcase absolute combat perfection, and come up with 200 IQ solutions to 4 IQ problems to avoid as much of this unholy flaming dogshit as possible. And these strategies immediately come into play with our first two enemies. With the way Resident Evil 8 is designed, throughout the game there are certain checkpoints or triggers that, when hit, will reset enemies to their starting positions or completely despawn them from an area. Instead of fighting the first Lycan, we can just run past him and grab the red bolt cutters from the shelf, which causes him to instantly vanish from the area. One slight oversight though was that this also despawned our 2 fingers that were digesting in this guy's lower intestine. Shit. Well, with this now being a 2 for the price of 1 challenge, we moved into the barn for a fight to the death with the second Lycan. Only one of us could leave this barn alive, and it was looking ever likely that it wasn't going to be me. But my 7 practice runs had garnered irrefutable proof that enemies in this game were extremely predictable, a fact that would be the only thing keeping this challenge alive. For our friend in the barn, we were no match for him in a straight up 1v1 on Rust, so we'd need to be smart. By positioning ourselves here next to the stairs, we can bait an attack, hit the Lycan twice, move backwards, and repeat, effectively stunlocking our pet werewolf's brain into oblivion to provide us with a free and easy way out of here. With all 8 of my fingers now sufficiently warmed up, it was time to trigger the village siege. In a sequence that made me feel so nostalgic I half expected Dr. Salvador to arrive, we were now asked to defend our remaining fingers and survive the attack, which was easier said than done. With Ethan moving with the athleticism of a reversing dump truck with no wheels and all attempts to cheat my way through here being checkmated by the devs, we had to think outside of the box. Or, more specifically, the door. Using a speedrunning strat, if we sit behind this door and hold W when the Lycans try to open it, Ethan, the immovable mold, and the Lycans, an unstoppable force, effectively cancels out the door's physics and holds all of us in place while still running the siege timer down. All that we had to do now was to hold the door. Okay, that's enough of that. Halfway through the siege timer though, the door strap becomes obsolete as enemies now begin to spawn in behind us, but by heading around and taking the slowest pace possible through the rest of the village, we keep the blockades up for as long as possible before we're grabbed and thrown at the feet of Crystal Meth Santa. Honestly, what the f*** is going on here? With the very fabric of my reality now in question, we bump into the village spinster, who they say starred in the world's first interracial hardcore loop. After collecting Mattis from Casino Royale, we get a traditional American greeting at Louise's house, but once inside, we have to let the team know some devastating news. The Resident Evil 8 Villager DLC was sold separately, and that sadly today, they were all being let go. With the team pardoned from life, we drop Helena off at the barbecue next door and pass homeless Jackie Weaver again, who was cackling away as she pissed herself in the middle of the street. With the whole place now smelling like a public toilet, we can open up the demon door and begin our path up to Castle Dimitrescu. Before we had the life forcibly milked out of us, we're greeted by local war crime enabler, the Duke, who would today sadly be as useful as septic tank flavoured mouthwash for most of this challenge. With no ability to upgrade the knife's base stats, the only spoils that we might be able to partake in were case upgrades and the occasional healing item. How disappointing. Upon entering the castle, the flies engulfing us were not in fact connected to the huge amounts of dog shit that we just walked through Lady D's entrance hall. These flies were in fact the sins that Jesus had died for.
Man blood.
With a less than ideal method of transportation en route to our sickle-induced castration, we're delivered to the moment that we had all been secretly waiting for.
Now, let's take a look at him.
Whoa! This wasn't the juicy vampire lady experience that we'd been expecting. Despite still working that outfit, the male pretender claimed to be Chris, Ethan's son. But it couldn't be. Our Chris was a child, and this Chris had a head that was in proportion to the rest of his body. Adult Chris didn't have time to explain, but he was the one who had made the anonymous tip-off to Ethan to get him to Romania. Chris says just to hang tight and he'd explain everything later. But before we could do or say anything, Chris snaps back into character so as to not blow his cover, leaving us to bleed out in the bedroom like we were a piece of dry-aged beef. Continuing the theme of feeling like I was on hardcore drugs, this revelation was probably not even the weirdest one so far today. But after unhanging ourselves from the ceiling, it looked like this mysterious character was in fact telling the truth. There was a grate, and we could escape out of here. If he wasn't lying about that, what else was he telling the truth about? Well, that was a question for later, when the plot develops. For now, the focus needed to be on escaping the Twilight Murder Castle, which required us to find 4 masks hidden throughout the halls of this sexually tense establishment to unlock this door. But between us and those masks, we had to fight our way through Lady D's dysfunctional daughters, starting with the first of the 3. After sprinting our way through this highly unsanitary basement of meth addicts, I know what you're thinking. Our first proper boss fight. This should be a nice way to ease ourselves into the challenge. Well, no. You're wrong. Murder was a way of life for Bella, and she was on course to ruin our day at record speeds. Now, let's just say Inferno Nemesis was an 8 out of 10 on the shithole scale. Bella's fight whilst doing this challenge was so far off the scale that I couldn't quantify it, and this was purely because of 2 very annoying reasons. There are 2 crackheads that show up with Bella exclusively in Village of Shadows that turn what was supposed to be a straightforward fight into an impossible 3v1 stabbing simulator. Add in an overly claustrophobic arena and a weapon that dealt as much damage as being hit in the face with one of Chris's used nappies, and we had all of the ingredients here for a potential stroke. To try and prevent the imminent rupturing of this long overdue aneurysm, we had to squeeze out as much DPS as we possibly could, and without any upgrades available, there was really only one way we could do this. By using block. It sounds pretty dumb, but Ethan has a 2-second cooldown in between his standard mouse 1 knife slashes. But by pressing the guard button in between attacks, we can completely remove that cooldown, increasing our attack speed and converting us into a certified spanker of vampire cheeks. However, the reality was that a 2.4% DPS increase probably wasn't going to give me the edge in this fight. What was making me itch though was the fact that this fight had quickly turned into a living hell. The rate at which I was being sent back to the main menu was astronomical. Sometimes I didn't even get to make a single attack. I'd become the first person in history to be spawn killed in a Resident Evil game. Only 23 deaths in, and I'd already had to mute Ethan's voice as listening to his constant whining death rattle was making me tweak. This fight alone was the clearest evidence that you needed on why nobody ran this shit. By Death 39, I'd physically and mentally degraded into Hector Salamanca, with my only retained ability now being to press the reset checkpoint button. 2.5 hours later, and with no meaningful progress made, I did what any reasonable person in my situation would do. I searched YouTube. After watching 2.5 hours of Office bloopers, I'd stumbled across Best Gamer Chad, who'd shown me that there was actually a path to victory here. It seemed as though the RE engine could only handle 2 enemies attacking you at the same time. So in a situation where 3 enemies were trying to rupture your spleen at the same time, then the 3rd enemy would need to take their place in the castle cuck chair and wait their turn. So by pulling all 3 of these adulterers back into the corridor, there is a chance, through what appears to be complete blind luck, that we can get 2 maidens to focus us, which basically paralyzes Bella against her will into just a simple observer. Speed was of the essence though. Murdering just 1 participant here would balance the equation, bringing Bella back to life. But as always, the hard truth here was that simply possessing this knowledge, or in fact even killing the 2 maidens, did not guarantee success.
Narrator dialogue. OK. Button. Alt and O. Heads up. Narrator keyboard changes. We've updated the narrator keyboard layout so it more closely matches the experience you may have had with other screen readers. If you want narrator to tell you what commands are associated with the keys you're pressing, you can turn on input learning by pressing caps lock +1. To turn it off, press caps lock +1 twice. To learn more, press Ctrl and Windows logo key and N to open your narrator settings and access the online user guide.
No thank you.
Narrator heading.
I suffered for hours and hours at the mercy of the fickle mistress of RNG. I was stuck in an endless cycle of psychological torture as Bella ripped my dick off again and again and again. This was a gaming recession, and the currency was our happiness.
Holy fucking shit.
That was until something happened, something that I had never seen before. With the maximum occupancy of this corridor apparently reached, when Bella is pushed behind us here, it appears as though she clips out of bounds and gets stuck behind the rubble or the table behind us. I tried afterwards to replicate this, but I never could. It felt as though Jesus Christ himself had looked down on us today and gifted us what was a complete anomaly. With nerves of steel, we avoid another TTS keyboard smash and dissolve both the maidens without Bella's interference before turning our attention to her. Like a high school bully, she'd thought she was so funny, but now she was by herself. She didn't seem to be laughing anymore. Just 2 minutes later, and with Bella finally calcified into white dog shit, the cursed time loop that had held us captive for 5 hours had finally been broken. 1 sister was down, 2 more to go.
We've updated the narrator keyboard layout.
With the courtyard key retrieved from upstairs, we head down into the cellar to showcase another tech that we'd be using throughout this run. So in a similar way to how a higher frame rate in Resident Evil 2 Remake, for example, increases the amount of frames the knife has to deal damage through a target, the inverse is also true. In some Resident Evil games, a reduction in frame rate means that our opportunity to receive inbound damage is also decreased. Think of it like trying to put your finger in between a spinning fan. The higher the speed of the fan, the more likely you are to hit your finger on the blade. By us lowering our FPS to 30 and temporarily destroying our visual enjoyment of the game. Ew, oh my god, this is fucking disgusting. What the fuck? We also reduce our collision frames, which allows us to squeeze through tight corridors and past enemies without getting hit, something that just wouldn't be possible on 60 or 120. So after slipping through the basement like we were covered in olive oil, we take the lift upstairs, revert this absolute sin to our eyes, and like some 8-fingered pervert, we sit at Lady D's window, listening in as she gets a strange phone call.
Yo, Duque, pick up the phone.
Yo.
What's up?
Unfortunately, she finds out that not only had we been behind the phone call, but also that we'd been the ones rummaging around her underwear drawer. Being thrown through the floor by a
Supersized bitch.
could have ended badly, so I guess I was just grateful that we didn't lose any additional fingers. A quick lap around the arena to pick up our own severed hand allows us to grab the Mask of Sorrow en route back up to the surface. An ode, no doubt, to the sadness that Ethan felt as he superglued yet another limb back to his mouldy, disintegrating body. With Lady D now chasing us around the estate trying to put us through yet another third-story floor, we drop the hottest remix of 2024 in the Opera Hall, retrieve the Iron Key and meet up for a romantic dance with Sister Number 2. Now, Daniela was undoubtedly the easiest of the three sisters. By completely ignoring the laws of thermodynamics, we open the sunroof above and immediately create a 6 major ice age inside this room. With this open, Daniela was permanently in her vulnerable state, allowing us to dodge and bait her predictable attack patterns and deal consistent damage. Now, usually, in any other Resident Evil game, being put onto critically low health was a death sentence, but for Ethan, it gave us a chance to showcase another mechanic that we'd be abusing throughout this challenge. Like a combination of Wolverine and that rampant mold growing in that Tupperware you forgot about in the back of your car, after 30 seconds, Ethan will begin to passively regenerate health until he heals out of danger and into the lowest part of caution. Pretty handy. With Daniela swatted away and the Mask of Joy in our possession, we had now regrettably reached our first forced gun usage. Now, I wasn't going to count this as an official failure. For once, I was actually going to cut myself some slack. We don't have a choice here, as 4 of the 5 bells to open this secret door are located way out of range of our knife, so instead we'll just add these 4 bullets to the naughty list and summarize at the end of the challenge. After sprinting across the rooftops and dodging the flying penis-nosed demons, we had the Mask of
Green, what's your problem, Green?
in our possession, and with one final mask remaining, we confronted our final sister. Cassandra exhibited strong psycho ex-girlfriend energy, but her predictable attack patterns and lack of work colleagues sit her in the middle of the sister difficulty ratings. Nearly beating her without taking any damage, the only sticking point for the fight was that to force Cassandra into her vulnerable state, we'd need to break this wall, which can't be done with a knife for obvious physics-based reasons, so instead would need to be done with the help of a pipe bomb. With the final mask of horniness now retrieved, we thanked Lady D for her hospitality and head down to put all 4 of the masks in place, finally unlocking our way out of here. Conveniently, this door leads us directly to Lady D's kryptonite, who had been unironically keeping it within walking distance of her bedroom.
So that was a fucking lie.
With one well-placed stab from our weapon of vampire destruction, we unleashed Lady D's final form. This episode of House of the Dragon wasn't my favourite, and with Lady D's health pool sitting at an eye-watering 9,000 HP, this was the largest of any enemy that we'd faced so far. Whipping out the Casio calculator watch again, that meant that we'd need to hit her 450 times. Jesus Christ. Through a series of test runs, I found that she has 3 main attacks. The charge attack, which she does when she lands on the tower with us, the mosquito attack that she does until the 2 towers were destroyed, and the swoop down and body slammers attack. But there was only one attack that we could use to do damage to Lady D. The first step was that we needed to wait for her to land on the tower. Once she does, she'll begin walking around looking for us, and as soon as we get in range, she'll begin to turn red as she looks to perform her charge attack. As soon as we see this, we'd need to move to the right towards the wall before cutting back in left, but there's a further complexity here to consider before we can begin whittling down her health. There are 2 potential outcomes with this attack. Either Lady D will charge further up and over the parapets, which means that we could immediately work on reducing that magic number of 450, or she'll do a much shorter charge forward, meaning she'll back up much quicker. This outcome has the potential to engulf us in her midriff, which sounds like a good time, but is also where her flesh-eating bugs sit, waiting to devour our innocent Christian body. So if we do get the second outcome, we just need to hold W for longer to force our way past this danger zone before knifing. Whilst that did mean that we would miss out on some additional damage compared to outcome 1, we do avoid potentially being eaten alive, which would help to steady my increasing heart rate in the later stages of this fight. Anytime that we did take damage, we could just hide in the turret or stay on the opposite side of the tower until we'd sufficiently regenerated our body. With 450 hits to issue out, so began this war of attrition. With my fingers bleeding, 14 deaths, and a truly unacceptable amount of time to be listening to Lady D just consistently insult us, taking just over 45 minutes, her first phase had finally been completed. Her second phase required a similarly disciplined approach. By waiting for the anemic dragon to turn red, we dodged right before running back to hit her with the Fruit Ninja special, simply repeating this for 9 minutes straight. It wasn't until I began editing this video that I realised you don't actually get a checkpoint at the start of phase 2. Luckily, I didn't die or reset. That could have been unfortunate. The thought alone was enough to make your butthole pucker, but we were finally released from our vampiric BDSM dungeon experience and were free to pursue our goals, starting with exploring the second half of the village. The careful, painstakingly prepared Lycan ambush is countered by just sprinting through to this door to despawn them all, but sadly that luck runs out with our next Lycan stalker. Having sufficiently digested our fingers, our friend/abuser was back to subject us to another violent rendition of This Little Piggy Went to Market. With Lycan Joe Goldberg not taking no for an answer, on our 8th rejection we issue him with a restraining order in the form of the sweet embrace of death.
Hello. You.
With the jack handle retrieved, a new group of stalkers arrived, which to mere mortals may have seemed problematic, but for us, all it takes is running straight back through to this house to despawn all the enemies from the entire area, allowing us to jack the tractor off in peace. With the tractor sufficiently cranked to completion, we now needed to make it into the house with the red chimney, but with no gun to pre-shoot the lock at the door, we needed to take the long way around, which sadly puts us on a collision course with Sauron himself.
I see.
With no ring to provide him apart from the one in my pants, these guys were less than impressed, but not nearly as unimpressed as I was with myself after missing the very obvious red ladder to the house 3 times. I don't want to talk about it. With the brain rot evidently taking hold of me, we head into the house and collect the 4-winged key to begin our involuntary acid trip.
No!
The whole of Donna's level was basically us just slipping into a K-hole for 30 minutes straight. We lose all of our weapons right at the start of the basement section, so don't have any problems finishing the level, meaning that we can dodge our child support payments, stab a mentally ill woman in the face, and finally retrieve the newest upgrade to the 4-winged key. With Donna's demise, we'd officially unlocked another set of services from the Duke. By collecting ingredients from animals scattered across the village, we could provide them to the Duke, who in a sponsored collab with Gordon Ramsay would take them to create recipes that would expand the palate and tantalise the senses.
We've gathered all the ingredients.
Duck! Fogger!
Yes, chef.
Where's the lamb sauce? Where's the lamb sauce?
Personally, I'm not eating anything from a man preparing food with those feet, but the finest quality of these dishes did have the ability to boost our in-game stats. We could gain increases to our max health, increase our speed, or reduce damage taken from blocking. My only problem with this was that butchering these poor animals with a weapon that would struggle to cut through oxygen was subjecting them to excruciating agony, and this was making me sad. Despite immediately wanting to turn vegan, for now, we didn't have enough ingredients for a single chicken nugget, so would temporarily remain the ones on the menu, as a random homeless man proceeded to try and make our internal organs external organs. Sprinting through to the windmill, we slice our way through this green bogey wall and begin Moreau's section. The aim here was to make it through this water park for troglodytes and power on the dam, which would allow us to drain the water from the valley to clear us a route out of here. But Moreau, who looked like Mother Miranda had conceived him via the anus, had decided he wanted to make our time here as annoying and as smelly as possible. With the boat keys retrieved, we were able to cross the dam and reunite with adult Chris, and this time we wanted some answers. He explains that he had been sent from the future to save baby Chris's life in this timeline. Chris Redfield would go on to lead the resistance against Umbrella, becoming integral to its downfall and the subsequent saving of the world. Oh, okay, so we're just not coming up with original stories anymore, we're just reusing the Terminator plotline? Yeah, pretty much. Mother Miranda's role in all of this was still unknown, but it appeared as though she was working with someone to deliver baby Chris to the hands of an unknown third party. All that we knew was that if baby Chris was deleted,
Father, help!
boulders in this timeline would remain unpunched, Umbrella would be allowed to flourish, and the Redfield bloodline would truly be at an end. Adult Chris would stop at absolutely nothing to get baby Chris back. His life literally depended on it. But before adult Chris could finish explaining the plan, the fish finger incel from earlier had found us, cutting through the entire house and separating Ethan from the rest of the team. Now, the entirety of Moreau's section was just a series of switches and steps to navigate through. There is regrettably one more forced gun usage to knock out this plank of wood to help us cross the water, but barring that, we had a clear route through to powering the floodgates back on and removing Moreau's advantage. Everything was proceeding as planned. Until it wasn't. Moreau believed that by forcibly giving us dysentery, he would win Mother Miranda's approval, so for us to get to the exit, we'd need to convert him into Kadu sushi. So just to create a quick visual comparison for you here, Daniela, Bella and Cass all had 3,000 health, and Lady D herself had 9,000. Moreau has 25,000 health points. Under any normal circumstances, I'd be saying GG, see you later. There was no way in hell we were making it through this in a straight up dogfish fight. But lucky for us, Moreau has one weakness, one critical flaw in the design of his arena. This single, simple piece of wood. Immediately at the start of the fight, if we reduce our FPS down to 30, we can slip in behind Moreau and lure him towards this area in the middle lane, the place that would become his metaphorical prison. By baiting his lunge attack and forcing him to land here in this square, Moreau becomes stuck in an infinite cycle of lunge attacks. By waiting for his anemic little Salazar body to come back up, we stick to a strict rule of stabbing 3 times, moving back as we trigger the lunge attack again, and then moving in and repeating again. Moreau does have several health triggers throughout this fight where he'll leave the sanctity of this cheese spot and move up top to projectile vomit everywhere. All we had to do when he does this was to cut through any chunder barriers and lure him back to the safety of this spot once he'd finished. Now, I wouldn't say that this strategy was without risk, but for the most part, it was preferable to whatever bullshit we may have had to do here instead. So off we went, stabbing away for what felt like an eternity. This whole fight was a test of endurance. Just one slip up and we'd potentially be wasting hours of progress, forced to restart this hell all over again. But for the most part, I was chilling. I stuck on a podcast to pass the time.
I'm Dr. Matthew Ziegelman, a urologist at Mayo Clinic. In this video, we'll cover the basics of erectile dysfunction.
And took regular breaks to stay fresh and kept my focus razor sharp. And in a rare display, for one time only, we did deliver perfection. 1 hour and 39 minutes of passing kidney stones through my fingers, and Moreau's gluten intolerance was identified as a weakness, and one piece of white bread thrown into his mouth later. Applying ice to my immensely swollen wrists, it was finally over, and miraculously we'd used our regenerative capabilities to not use a single heal throughout that fight, building up a nice stockpile on hand, ready to tackle the stronghold. With a herb and some mysterious pre-packaged cured meats collected from the slaughterhouse, we used the boat to head upstream to collect some fish so the Duke can finish the lamb sauce, endowing us with a boost to our max health, a serious reduction to the damage we took from blocking, and a speed increase, which I'm convinced did absolutely nothing. Sadly, our final ingredient, the juicy game, is up in this tree, meaning our large health bonus was off the table, which, approaching the gates of the stronghold, would be sorely missed. It was no underestimation to say that this haven of butt sniffers would initiate a series of events that were the most difficult that this challenge had to offer, shown evidently as I died 12 times just trying to get the door open. Eventually, once inside this furry convention, we had a decision to make. There's a first aid bottle downstairs placed suspiciously on this barrel. Undoubtedly a trap, but my little goblin brain refused to leave it behind. This little pot of CBD oil could be the difference between failure and slightly less failure. The margins were tight on this challenge, and one heal could save our life. The only issue is that once down there, the area fills up with lichens, making it impossible to leave with my arsehole still intact. After dying 9 times to these dogs, I'd remembered the FPS tech. With a simple reduction to 30 FPS again, with the assist of some god-tier RNG, we can squeeze past the hordes here, use the zipline and slip past the final group of enemies guarding these double doors, giving us access to the catacombs deep below the stronghold. But this victory had the shelf life of warm milk. Grab your tissues, gamers, because we had now entered the hardest part of this challenge, and it wasn't even close. Urias was a D-tier boss fight. The D stood for Dick, and we were about to receive an enormous amount of it right into my poor, tired arse. Homeless 4 was utterly committed to giving me CPR whilst I was still alive. The demigod had an insane amount of health that we needed to reduce with a weapon that felt as though we were gently fondling his balls, compared to Urias, whose hammer blew our soul straight out of our body if he so much as looked in our general direction. Like others before him, Urias does have an Achilles heel. The Achilles heel felt more like a ray-shielded particle exhaust vent leading straight from the Death Star's surface directly into its reactor core, but it sadly was all that we had. So if you can get Urias to do this spin attack, his column pickup attack, or his front smash attack, moving directly behind him after those attacks causes him to do a 180 counter slam, which if we slide to his left as he's doing it and set up directly behind him, we force him to repeat that 180 attack again. The timing and placement of this loop was precise and extremely difficult to maintain. If we were just one frame off, or Urias just didn't fancy doing it anymore, he'd turn around and provide us with free facial reconstructive surgery. Time and time again, we were force-fed shit by this gigantic hulking drug addict, and after my 26th death, it was evident that despite the cost now being sunk, the fallacy would be forced to continue. The fight takes a turn for the worse, however, as if being abused by this crackhead wasn't already bad enough. Either via RNG, or if you can do enough damage to trigger this sequence, Urias will jump up onto this platform and call in his Lycan care package. And this, my friends, is what truly saturated this fight with gamer AIDS. This was the Bella fight, but on Liver King levels of steroids.
That was a lie.
With the Lycans in the arena, it was impossible to get Urias stuck in that cycle again, so our focus has to shift to fighting them instead of Urias. But the sticking point was that Urias only spends about 4 or 5 minutes down here before jumping back up to the platform to call for reinforcements again. That meant that if we didn't defeat them quickly enough, we could find ourselves caught in a constant cycle of Lycans, never being able to deal damage to Urias and eventually being grinded down to our inevitable death. Any other melee weapon here and we'd likely have enough DPS to power through these uninvited house guests, but instead we're forced to have our dignity stripped away from us again and again, as it looked more and more likely that beating this challenge was locked behind an insurmountable skill issue. But as always, there was a single solitary light at the end of what was a very dark tunnel. The only real option we had to achieve the speed we needed here was to enable friendly fire. Like a Modern Warfare 2 hardcore lobby, Urias doesn't pay much attention to who he hits, so by luring the Lycans underneath his initial jump attack as he arrives back in the arena, if the RNG was strong, they could be crushed straight away. If it wasn't, we'd have to waste precious time baiting them into Urias' other attacks. Sadly for us, this truly was the only way. Phase 1 was chronic AIDS. The deaths continued to pile up, and 4.5 hours of dying to this piece of werewolf garbage, we were no closer to Heisenberg's factory. Despite being grossly unmedicated for this, on deaths 65, 79 and 86, I'd made another potentially life-saving discovery. Urias has another HP trigger. At around 13,000 HP, which was about 60% of his total health remaining, his attack cycle changes. He no longer will jump back up to the platform every 4 minutes. Instead, he can now do it from the ground floor, summoning in 4 Lycans instead of 2, and this was our unlikely window of opportunity. If we can stunlock him in that same cycle as we did in Phase 1, before he summons those 4 Lycans in, he will stay stuck in that cycle until he dies. That means we can prevent any more Lycans from spawning in and put all of our effort into dealing with Urias instead. Whilst this was huge, and was the only possible win condition that we had, the obvious sticking point was getting there. I had now died 102 times, with my attempts ranging from mild success to wanting to rip my eyes out. That was until attempt 103. Not only had I created an environment of discipline and focus, but I found that if for whatever reason I lost that critical cycle in Phase 2, if I acted quickly enough and stabbed Urias in the face, he would do a frontal slam attack instead of calling his friends in, which just so happens to be one of the few chosen attacks that we could reinitiate the cycle from. I cannot put into words just how uncomfortable, difficult and draining this fight was, but after spending over 6.5 hours stuck in this godforsaken cave, Urias finally crumbled away into dust. Like Ethan, I myself now felt like I was made out of black mold, and despite my anxiety at only having a single heel left to my name, Heisenberg's factory awaited us. As we sat down for our casting couch audition, Heisenberg commended us on our knife-only attempts, but told us that we were being played. Not everything about our adult son, Chris, was as it seemed. Now, Heisenberg could tell Ethan the truth of what was happening here in the village, but only if we helped him fix up some soldats in the factory for him to help kill Miranda.
Don't even worry about it, Ethan. All you gotta do is just rip off their Johnson and insert a drill in there.
Yeah, I'm ready to be thrown down into the hole now. But as we plummeted down into the factory below, not knowing this information about Chris had left me feeling uneasy. Worries aside, a quick FPS change to 30 gets us past the Apple Vision Pro nerds at the entrance to the vent, and once through, we arrive ready to explore the depths of Heisenberg's sex dungeon. The doors throughout B4 were configured with glowing red G-spots. An interesting innovation on the standard lock and key, but with another FPS switch we squeezed past the enemies guarding the way down into the smelly bowels of B4. This big hulking piece of sheet metal guarding the furnace we needed was the first of many Village of Shadows enhancements in the factory. Iron Man Mark -1 is regrettably completely invulnerable to any attack from the knife, so anytime we'd see these guys we'd need to be going in the opposite direction. Up the stairs to the left we dodged past more Oculus Enjoyers before reloading our most recent checkpoint at the dentist chair. By doing this, the enemies outside would be reset to their original unaggroed positions outside this door, meaning we could deal with what was apparently the peak male DIY form without them blocking us in here. With the emblem mold retrieved, we run in and sneakily place it in the furnace behind the big guy before running back to here. The reason was to reset the furnace room. Running back to this point forces all of our recently awakened enemies back to their starting positions, meaning we could run in, grab the horse emblem and place it in the wall without any resistance. Downstairs in the machinery room, health and safety were words that had no meaning. But we eventually timed a perfect run through the waiting entourage here to the ladder. Now, just as I was about to head through to the grate, I heard someone get absolutely clattered downstairs. Keen to momentarily relax and watch some trogs get punched around by hydraulic factory machinery, I went back downstairs and couldn't believe what my eyes were ingesting. The machinery had regrettably crushed these guys to death, creating a slam dunk workplace lawsuit that Heisenberg would have to deal with. But for us, they had dropped not one, but 2 herbs. Whilst herbs had been at a premium, I had a huge overstock of chem fluids, so it was no exaggeration to say that this was a game changer. With the remaining 3 enemies down here also sent to the big factory in the sky, we got another 2 more herbs, boosting our heal inventory back up to 7 and completely overturning our healing deficit from Urias. With the cog mold in hand, we dodged past another man seeking to drill me in the arsehole before repeating our furnace strat from before. With the freshly forged cog now restoring power to the rest of the facility, we solid snaked our way around the new sections of B4, opening the remaining doors before being cut off by Sturm on our way through to B3. After slipping by with another FPS switch, we entered Heisenberg's Minecraft server where he'd apparently set his bots to AFK mine diamonds for him, and whilst we were just going to leave them to do their work in peace, I thought, what if these guys also dropped herbs? Well, it was enough of an excuse to try, and after luring them over to the vent, we sliced their shins until they died from cringe and collected 3 more herbs from the 5 enemies in here. My weird obsession with needing more herbs to satisfy my needs continued back into B4's entrance and the start of the factory, where the 5 enemies here provided another 3 more herbs out of their cold, pale bodies. I don't know what I'd done to deserve this herb RNG, but it completely changed the prospect of the game's final fights and my future health requirements. Feeling more confident than ever that we had everything we needed to beat this challenge, we entered an area called the Grinder Shaft Walkway, where we incur a further 6 forced gun usages. 4 shots are required to blow the red bulbs out on the grinder itself to disable it, and 2 shots in the ventilation ducts to stop another fan from turning us into sliced mold. Once complete, we can unlock a secret door through to B1, and with Heisenberg's super secret key successfully molded, we can unlock the foundry door back up on B1. However, to ensure the run back upstairs wasn't all fun, 2 panzers arrived to stop us from getting back out. Luckily, the first one we can simply move to the right to completely avoid, and despite the second one cutting us off in an extremely tight corridor, if we lure him out of it and quickly lower our FPS again, we can pass him wide and bring us 1 step closer to exiting this Amazon warehouse from hell. Or just a normal Amazon warehouse. But before we could take that next step, opening Heisenberg's secret door starts the fight with his sentient air conditioning unit. Now, Sturm was quite harmless. Look, he literally has no arms. And whilst initially he felt quite awkward to fight, as getting touched by his fan blades instantly turned us into human salami, after some practice, the fight required nothing more than patience. The first step is to get Sturm to break through all of the walls here to open up a nice, clear arena. Now, Sturm's primary attack in his first phase is to run forward and charge, so by sitting in front of any solid surface that isn't breakable, either a wall or these metal boxes, causes him to get stunned. Once Sturm hits the wall, his back outtake fan will be exposed for us to do damage. However, this can be extremely awkward, and if we wanted to avoid being insta-murdered midway through this arduous fight, our preparation and execution would need to be perfect. So through my extensive experience, I discovered that depending on which side you dodged past Sturm to avoid his charge attack would dictate which direction he moved after he hit the wall. By knowing which direction he was going to turn, we can just hold W and A or D whilst knifing the back outtake fan with the confidence that we weren't going to accidentally slip into his blades. Those specific movement inputs allows us to just slide off the back of Sturm as he turns, and after 5 disciplined stabs we can move back away to the opposite wall and simply repeat. At around 65% and 34% health remaining, he'll switch to a flaming charge attack, pinballing around the arena walls 3 times before blowing fire everywhere. Mostly this is just inconvenient, but by luring him behind the metal boxes in either corner, his flame attacks were largely subdued, keeping the arena clear. But once Sturm drops below 15% health, he sits permanently in that attack, turning this place into Mordor and forcing us to use 2 bottles of aloe vera gel to soothe our burning flesh. At the time, I was annoyed about this, but in retrospect it seemed preferable to just, dying. And 30 minutes and 5 deaths later, Sturm's armless corpse was laid to rest, allowing us to press on to deal with Wish.com Magneto. With Heisenberg throwing us off the top of Nakatomi Plaza down into the depths below, we meet up with none other than our boy Chris. Adult Chris believed that whatever information Heisenberg did have could be subterfuge. Whatever it was, our best course of action was for Heisenberg to be permanently recycled. Whilst Ethan wasn't fully convinced, Chris did have some elite memes on his phone which were good enough to occupy my ADHD attention span for now. With the tools of plastic warfare now in our hands, we begin our fight with the greatest meth producer this side of Romania. Oh, wait, no, sorry, wrong franchise. With the tank sadly not coming equipped with the default knife add-on, or apparently the ability to just use functioning doors instead of blowing them up, we had to use the first of 3 forced uses of the tank's depleted uranium rounds on the elevator door, and instead would have to focus on beating Heisenberg using the next best thing. Heisenberg's industrial-grade welding tutorial was, as you'd expect, tedious to say the least. Whilst we don't take any damage to our personal bodice in this fight, leaving our health reserves nicely untouched, the tank, which had the same durability as a Little Tykes Cozy Coupe, could only sustain 3 or 4 hits before getting completely totaled. Which isn't ideal, as Heisenberg was as slippery as your ice when it came to maintaining some kind of discernible loop. First step was to drive up to him and bait out his initial attack. Once done, we'd need to move in immediately with the chainsaw out, specifically to this door on his right-hand side. From there, once he attacks, he'll try to force his way around to hit us, which, due to his turning circle reaching speeds exceeding Mach fuck, was impossible to keep up with. However, a quick increase of our DPI to 1200 and our mouse was now as sensitive as someone with IBS after eating Taco Bell breakfast. With our newfound power of not having to use half a mile of desk space to keep up with Heisenberg, we could now tuck in underneath his opening attack without issue. Once he stops moving around here, we would need to move across his front over to his left, basing out another attack before moving in the same way across back to the right. We'd repeat the cycle once more, which is where Heisenberg enters his second phase of attacks. Now, this can vary. It can be RNG what we get, but ideally we want to try and get him stuck in a loop of driving forward, trying to catch up to us, like so. With us tucked into this door area again, we just had to constantly try and stay close to his side, which the increase in DPI certainly helped to do. If we ever did lose our sweet spot here, we just had to try and repeat that first attack cycle again so we could dodge from left to right and rejoin that side loop again. 18 minutes of constant chainsaw abuse later and we triggered the second part of the fight, but it could sadly only be initiated with another forced rocket launcher shot to Heisenberg's forehead. With Heisenberg losing his factory full of weird drill sex dolls, we were now on the ground and back with the default knife. Whilst quite intimidating and with about 9,000 HP to spread away with our tools of mild inconvenience, there is a concept of a plan here. By starting with an opening gambit of running out to the right to dodge that first attack, running back into Heisenberg's left or right, we can force ourselves into this little area here. We should be able to see this weird little mechanical tumor here, and by just holding W as we knife, we should be able to stick to Heisenberg's side around the arena as he performed his attacks. At least that's what I aimed for. This fight was littered with moments that would pucker even the strongest of arseholes. With my fingers and wrists now in absolute tatters, I was nearing my lactic acid limit. But just 9 more minutes of this torture, which dragged the Heisenberg fight to nearly 27 minutes long, one final forced rocket launcher shot from the Hot Wheels tank puts Heisenberg down for good. As we went to celebrate finally ridding our safe space of this dysfunctional family, Miranda, who had metaphorically stolen my heart at various points throughout this challenge, had now physically stolen it. Despite feeling an odd sense of arousal with yet another body part removed, I had questions. So you're saying you're Mother Miranda, but you're also the old spinster lady, right? The same old spinster lady who was urinating in the street at the start of the game. Listen, I just can't with this script anymore. What do you want me to do with this shit? It makes no goddamn sense. With Miranda issuing out the 5-point palm exploding heart technique to Ethan, it now fell to adult Chris to reacquire himself and preserve the sacred timeline. Miranda apparently had baby Chris down at the altar, so that's where Chris and his team of steroid abusers were heading. Now for us, we luckily don't have to deal with the default trash anymore. Chris, being the alpha male that he was, had the karambit as his starting knife. Mostly this part of the game was just Chris's world, and the Lycans had the misfortune of living in it. The man was an absolute beast. Possessing almost superhuman strength and durability, Chris left a trail of crippled Lycans in his wake as we punched and ran our way through to the altar. Once here, we're forced to use the targeting laser designator 3 times to blow ourselves a hole into the Mega Mycetes layer, where we find our worst possible nightmare guarding the path through. Urias' big brother, Urias number 2. This guy was bigger in every sense of the word, but like his brother, he had an Achilles heel. A literal Achilles heel. Crouching and hugging his left leg provided us with an almost impenetrable blind spot to his attacks. We could just sit here and do continual damage to Urias 2 whilst avoiding the majority of his attacks. Some we couldn't dodge, meaning that we'd need to displace ourselves or block from time to time, but after discovering that moving my camera up and down allowed the karambit to hit additional parts of his leg to deal even more damage per swing, we accelerated Urias 2's reunion with his brother down in white dog shit hell. Heading down into the depths of the Mega Mycetes layer, Chris stumbles across Miranda's private quarters, finding evidence that suggested none other than Oswald Riz Spencer had been here trying to clap some Mega Mycete cheeks all those years ago. After fighting through the collective groans from the RE community as the carefully crafted lore is strategically shit on, Chris began his journey up to the altar. Oddly reminiscent of last Sunday when we left Bottomless Brunch, Ethan suddenly awoke lying in a puddle of his own shit, wondering just how many more limbs and organs we'd have to lose before we could finally achieve the sweet embrace of death. It was clear that the crippling arthritis we'd collected throughout this challenge was degrading our hands at an accelerated rate. Before we lost them for good and could finally pass on to the Shadows of Rose DLC, we had one final task to complete. Waking up from our mold-induced nightmare, we find ourselves in the back of the Duke's medieval Uber, who was immensely excited to profiteer off the war crimes we were about to commit as we moved up to the final showdown with Miranda. With Lee Harvey Oswald apparently covering us from the ridge up top, Miranda's final form looked like she wanted to wake us up when September ended.
Because tonight will be the night.
But with another crack of our aged knuckles, we headed in for one last carpal tunnel any percent run to put this hell to bed once and for all. Miranda, despite being the final boss of the game, wasn't the challenge that you might have expected. Despite having a decent-sized health pool, all of her attacks were extremely predictable, giving us plenty of opportunity to counter her. Phase 1 is basically just a tasting platter for all of the different attacks that she uses throughout the fight. The first phase is her trying to bitch slap us back to Louisiana, the second is her Spider-Man phase, the third is her Magpie phase, and her fourth is the Guerrilla Warfare phase. There's also a Chernobyl explosion just before we hit phase 2, but this happened just the once and we can just block it to negate most of the damage. Once we've done a full cycle through the 4 attacks, Miranda would now select any of the 4 phases at will, giving us a bit of variety to the fight, but with our 14 health pots ready and waiting to wash over us, she still didn't provide much of a challenge. With phase 2 being like every other fight so far in that it was long, tedious, and I was at my absolute limit of mouse 1 clicks after incurring 8 resets and spending 45 minutes degrading both of us. One final time, we divorced Miranda, invoking a final series of enforced gunshots to complete our annulment, reclaim our son, and conclude shooting for Taken 4. 29 hours, 227 resets later, and my overall quality of life depreciated beyond repair. The sacred timeline had been saved, and with only 7 enforced non-knife usages. The Mold Chronicles was now over. Adult Chris would go back to his timeline knowing that his future was secure, and baby Chris would grow into adult Chris and have to go through this same crazy bullshit again. We'd seemingly completed the impossible, and life could finally go back to normal.
Well, isn't this one big family reunion? So slow to catch on.